Me?
Yes, 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 yes.
Perfect.
I think that we are live.
We are live now?
Yes, I think so.
Yes,
Okay,
we're.
perfect. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar on open access today. My name is Abdullah. I am the liaison officer for medical education issues of the International Federation of Medical Student Associations. I need permission now to share my screen, please. Yes, perfect. So today we'll be having a very special guest, one of IFMSA's favorites, and a very loyal old friend of the IFMSA. Nick Shockey is the Director of Programs and Engagement for the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, SPARC. He is also founding director of the Right to Research Coalition and the lead organizer of OpenCon. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nick, and welcome.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
Thank you. So in today's webinar, we'll be discussing basically the history of open access and the movement itself, how it started, and how did we get where we are right now. We will also discuss in brief the theme of this year's Open Access Week, which is Open with Purpose, taking action to build structural equity and inclusion. We will go through students' roles towards open access, and Nick is definitely the expert that we need to ask, as he is involved with so many student organizations and alliances and coalitions. Then we will basically go back through what IFMSA has been doing on the field of open access throughout the years. And finally, we'll have some time for questions and answers. Okay, Nick, I'm sure our members cannot wait to hear from you. So now I will be giving you the floor. You also can share your screen.
Perfect. Let me get the right window here. Hold on a second. There we go. Is that coming through clearly on your end?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the lovely introduction, and it's always a pleasure to be speaking with IFMSA. As we were chatting before things kicked off, I was trying to remember my first IFMSA August meeting, which I think it was like 2011 or 2012. It's been some time now, but it really has been wonderful working, with IFMSA overall and with so many individual NMOs and folks within NMOs that have had a huge impact on certainly our work at Spark, our work at OpenCon, and the broader open movement. When you look at sort of folks we met through IFMSA, like Joe MacArthur, who's the founder of the Open Access Button Project, now a Spark team member. We met at the IFMSA March meeting in Baltimore, I think in 2013. Or Rushan Karan, the former head of Open Access Nepal, who's really helped push open access forward, both in his country of Nepal, along with the IFMSA NMO there, but also setting an example, much more broadly, and there's so many examples, that I could mention. I'll touch on some of those in this presentation, but just in short, if you're sort of new to this issue or IFMSA's involvement in opening up access to research and education, I think it's just important to start by knowing how much activity and involvement IFMSA has had and how much impact that action has had. So I've started in a different place more recently in my presentations, and in some of my past IFMSA presentations, I've done sort of more depth on sort of the history of open access and open research. And I'm happy to go into some detail there if folks find it helpful. But the sort of acceleration towards open research has started to progress at such a rate now that I found that it's in many ways helpful to just sort of try to cover current events as best as I can, because it's sort of a very quickly evolving situation. And I think the first part of my presentation will sort of be focused on you sort of showing that it's really less of a question of whether we get to a system for open research. I think it's pretty clear that we will. It's more a question of what that system will look like and whose interests will be prioritized, and whose interests that system will ultimately serve. So just to begin, I think, let's see if I can, there we go. Start, of course, with COVID and the coronavirus, which I think has, perhaps more than anything else, shown just how essential open research is, how urgent of an issue it is, and not just for coronavirus. So this is an article that was published early on in the pandemic on March 16th, actually by an OpenCon community member, Linda Liu, who published this in the South China Morning Post, essentially talking about how COVID might kill off sort of the dinosaur world of academic publishing or subscription-based journals. But the article really goes into detail on sort of why we can't wait to sort of access the results of research, both articles as well as data, in an urgent crisis like coronavirus. Which I think has borne out every day since this article was published. But as sort of medical professionals, you all know that obviously COVID's an incredibly pressing global priority and crisis. But for patients that have cancer, that have Alzheimer's, that have neglected and tropical diseases, that don't see the kind of research that they should, they feel the sort of urgency of sort of advancing the state of treatment and care, every bit as acutely, as folks that are worrying about getting COVID. And so if we're going to open up research for COVID, why wouldn't we do that for Alzheimer's, for cancer, for longer term diseases like heart disease that are a big killer in some countries. These things are urgent for everybody as well. And so I think the recent past of this year has just really shown and thrown into stark relief the high cost of keeping this information locked away. So the heartening thing is that there are global policies that are starting to sort of really push sort of research towards a state that's open by default. And so I'm going to spend the first third or so sort of walking through some of those policies and what they can tell us about sort of how sort of the future of open research is shaping up. So just starting in the US, where I'm based, the United States has had a policy in place since February of 2013 that requires that any articles funded with public dollars by the federal government here be made publicly accessible within 12 months of publication. So not immediately or openly available, but freely accessible within a year. And I put this slide up because this is an impact report from the Obama administration that they released at the end of that administration, listing their top 100 examples of impact that they had, and clocking in the top 15 was this policy that opened up federally funded research. And while I didn't actually include this in the slide, and IFMSA NMO actually helped us get this policy put into place. The president of the American Medical Student Association at the time, Liz Wiley, co-authored an op-ed that appeared in the print edition of the Washington Post, which is the major newspaper in Washington, D.C., shortly before this students across the country were going to be watching closely with the actions they took on this issue, or holding them accountable if they failed to take action. So parts of IFMSA were involved actually in helping to get this policy across the finish line, and it looks like that this policy will be strengthened. It's 7 years old now. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy actually issued a request for public comment to significantly strengthen this policy, to make all research and the data underlying that research immediately available on day one under a full open license. There hasn't been a policy announced just yet, but I think it shows clear intent for the current White House to strengthen this policy significantly. Of course, as many folks will know, we're heading into an election a week from today here in the U.S. The other candidate in the election, Vice President Joe Biden, is actually a fairly strong supporter of open research as well. And at the end of his tenure as vice president, actually speaking to a room full of cancer researchers, said this quote that you can see here. Talking about how essential it is for cancer researchers to share their research openly online. And that was a big push as part of his cancer research. But of course, this was 4 years ago. And I'm excited to share that actually, if any of you I have no idea why you would be political junkies about what's happening in the US, but there's a fairly popular podcast here called Pod Save America that had Vice President Joe Biden on over last weekend, actually, on the 24th. So literally 3 days ago. And in the course of this sort of wide-ranging interview that didn't have a particular focus on science, Vice President Biden directly spoke to open research being a priority. And then talking about his work on the Cancer Moonshot Initiative and his personal push to cure cancer, said these are great scientists, but they don't share information. They virtually didn't share any information. That's all changing now. It's changing drastically. And essentially is referencing open research in as many words. And I think his speaking to that in this interview sort of shows that interest in open research, that he expressed and acted on, and as vice president in 2016, likely would continue in a Biden administration. But of course, it's more than enough about the U.S. There are sort of similar policies that are already in place around the world. The president of the European Commission actually spoke to the importance of open research in her remarks at Davos at the World Economic Forum at the beginning of this year, when such things were still possible. Of course, the European Union has been sort of out front developing strong open research policies from very early on. In Canada, the government there in February announced a roadmap to move all of their research to be open by default over the next few years. Again, not just for articles, but also the data that underlies it. China is moving in the same direction as well, that have had a series of policies, getting stronger and stronger to open up the results of research. And actually, the former head of their National Science Library, Xiaolin Zhang, in an interview with the International Science Council, spoke to how China expects to see a fully open science environment over the coming few years. And of particular note on that front, I won't get too much into sort of research evaluation. It's a bit maybe of a wonky detailed topic, but I think it is worth mentioning that China's already talked about moving away from journal-based metrics like the impact factor, and instead really focusing on the value of an individual article rather than the container that it's published in, which could really help accelerate the push towards open. And that's something that we're seeing in the United States as well. My organization, Spark, is helping to co-convene with the United States' National Academies of Science a series of roundtable discussions with sort of leaders of universities, of funding organizations, a series of conversations about realigning incentives in the academy. Again, to focus more on the value of individual, sort of research contributions rather than just the journals that they're published in. Ultimately with the goal of accelerating the push towards open research. So these are sort of some of the policies that are already out there. There are of course many more that are in the works, and I'll just flag here that we expect to see movement in India as well. That hasn't come out with the precise policy yet, but there's this interview in Nature just a few weeks ago. Talking about the forthcoming Indian policy, and sort of what that's going to look like. And then it will likely focus more on sort of making articles accessible wherever they're published, rather than sort of requiring that they be published in a fully open access journal, which is a little bit different than some of the funders in Europe. And again, if folks want to get into those details about sort of the different types of open policies, happy to do that in the Q&A. So, I think all of these policies are pretty compelling evidence that research is becoming more open. But sort of the question for today and for this year's Open Access Week, and I think sort of the core question we need to be paying attention to, is whether research is actually becoming more equitable as it's becoming more open. And so, as the theme suggests, this is really what we're hoping to focus on for this year's Open Access Week. And this is actually the third year in a row that the theme has focused on some aspect of equity. Again, signaling that it's less of a question of whether we're going to get to a system for open and more what that system will look like. So this is a graph showing sort of the increasing cost of subscribing to academic journals. This is sort of the core problem that the move to open is meant to ameliorate or change. That for so long, the cost of academic publications and getting access to them has been, a huge barrier for folks, trying to get access, to medical journals to care for their patients, doing any other kind of, research or scholarship. I think this information is probably fairly well known within, IFMSA. I would typically start my presentations, years ago, just sort of talking about the common frustration of hitting a paywall and not being able to get access. I'm sure today that's still, something that everybody that's on this webcast has experienced, and that's because of the high cost. But there's sort of an inverse problem that sort of we risk creating in the shift to open, which is moving the barrier from accessing the research to having a barrier for being able to publish. And so there are sort of a large variety of models for open access journals. Most don't charge authors or readers, but a significant number of open access journals do charge what are called article processing charges to authors to cover the cost of publication, and that model is of deep concern to us because of the inequities that it replicates in open systems, in the ways that it can really disadvantage researchers or scholars that don't have the resources to pay for what can often be large fees, or even when there are waiver sort of systems in place to waive or reduce the cost of these charges. The way that still replicates inequities by sort of forcing researchers, frankly, in most countries, to have to rely on sort of charity of these journals rather than just having sort of a level playing field. And sort of data showing that this article processing charge model, the costs are increasing very, very rapidly. You can see this is a graph that's quite similar to this pricing graph, but is sort of following the cost of article processing charges over time, sort of roughly doubling from 2005 to, in this case, 2018, I believe, in this graph on average, which is something that, again, is concerning to us that we're following closely. But again, actually, in the last week, actually, there's been a significant announcement that honestly kind of breaks this graph. So this is a chart of average article processing charges. Last week, there was an announcement that a large research institution in Germany has agreed to basically flip their contract with Nature Publishing, the publisher behind Nature, to an open access sort of arrangement. And the sort of article processing charge that they agreed on in that arrangement was 9,500 euros. So, many multiples of sort of the top end of this graph. And actually, just for reference, this is sort of what that price point looks like plotted against that average price graph. And it sort of completely breaks the the chart. I think this high level of APC and sort of the increasing cost is just very deeply concerning to us, because we want an open system that's fundamentally and challenges of need to take that very seriously. And of course, this is just one APC. It's not an average, so this is plotting very different data on this chart. Important caveat there, but I think it's helpful to see sort of the scale of difference and how high this announcement of this APC was. But of course, cost isn't the only inequity that we need to pay close attention to. Last year, during Open Access Week, Barbara Rivera-Lopez published a great summary of some of her research on the Open Access Week website, calling out other types of inequities. And here she points out that there are a number of different disciplines where more than half of the editorial boards of journals are just from the United States and the UK alone. So less than half of the entire rest of the world combined. And if you looked at the boards, for the New England Journal of Medicine, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but I remember when I was speaking at the Ifmsa August meeting in Montreal, at the time, I believe, if memory serves, there were more members of the editorial board for the New England Journal of Medicine from the Boston area in the United States than Africa, Asia, and Latin America combined. And again, if memory serves, I think there's a similar issue with the Lancet. And that has a real impact, right? Who's on the editorial board and who has sort of power of these journals helps to define the global research agenda. By sort of influencing what questions are interesting, what's relevant, what gets published in these sort of fancy journals. And Barbara speaks to that as well in this piece, talking about the perceived editorial bias against authors in Africa and Asia and Latin America and most of the world. That some of it has to do with language and language inclusion, but also the fact that research topics that might be of most pressing interest, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, aren't prioritized by many members of editorial boards, or journals in a way that means that they're then marginalized and then go under-resourced and underexplored. I think probably many folks on this call are acutely well aware. Language diversity is a huge problem in research, with so much of it, only happening and only being accessible in English. Meaning that practitioners in local countries have a much sort of scarcer amount of resources to refer to, when trying to care for patients, for example, or do other types of research. And so even as we're transitioning to an open system, we still have a long way to go, to look at language diversity and inclusion and research, to look at editorial boards, to make sure things like grammar don't disqualify research that has, it's good research on the actual, on its merits, but gets dismissed because of, sort of grammar of most authors that are forced to write in a non-native language. There's also one other concern that I'll just touch on briefly. And again, this is by far an incomplete list of types of inequities, but one emerging type is the use of automated tools in peer review. That's still early days. And if you sort of open up this article in Nature from 2 years ago, you'll see Many folks go at lengths to say that these are just tools and that there's always a human reviewer that makes these calls at the end of the day. But I think we have to be really careful when we use AI in peer review, that it doesn't just sort of import biases that are already in the research literature and replicate those, but in a less visible way when doing research review. And again, getting back to that language sort of issue that Barbara Lopez flagged, you can see these kinds of tools easily sort of mistaking grammatical mistakes, or issues with sort of the language rather than the strength of the ideas that are presented in the paper, making it even more difficult for researchers that have to write in a non-native language to get published. So I think, again, those are some of the challenges. And as research is becoming more open, I think this is an area that we have to pay really close attention on whose terms is research becoming open and whose priorities do that, sort of the current system and the emerging open system reflect. And this is something that our organization Spark has been really active in following for the last couple of years. And at infrastructure.sparkopen.org, you can see a few of the reports that we put out on this question. But sort of one area that I want to highlight is the way that large commercial players have started to take over even more of the research process. So this is a figure from an article that was published by two students. Actually, it's a great example of sort of how next generation leaders are really leading the conversation here. Sort of illustrating the academic knowledge production process from sort of idea generation all the way through publishing to research evaluation. And if you overlay on top of sort of this process, the different acquisitions of the largest commercial publisher, Elsevier, you start to see how they are vertically integrated sort of all the way through the research process in a way that, again, I think is really concerning. And so you can see, see here all of the different, sort of acquisitions or Elsevier products that they now have, from discovery and sort of coming up with a research question to, data collection and analysis through the submission process, through the publication process, and then on the other end, selling tools like Pure and SciVal to university administrators that measure the productivity of research and sort of are tools that they use to guide investment decisions that universities make. And so, this vertical integration gives these commercial publishers even more control over the research market, makes it more difficult for researchers to work outside of this. And as research is becoming more and more reliant on digital technologies, and computerized tools, this kind of integration is more and more concerning. This plays out too. If you look at the mergers and acquisitions of this particular company, where in the late 90s they were mainly acquiring other journal publishers or journals themselves, but since 2009, they've been focusing a lot more on at what George Chin and Alejandro Posada call academic data analytics companies. So again, that vertical integration, tools like Mendeley, that are more about building platforms for research than journals. Skip a couple things in the interest of time to make sure there's plenty for Q&A. So to sort of to close, I want to talk a little bit about that how, as we are building new systems for research that are open, sort of the transitional moment that we're in right now, we really do have a unique opportunity to put equity at the core of our system for sharing research. That we can make it more fundamentally equitable, but to achieve that, we really have to be intentional. We have to push for that. It's not gonna happen on its own. And in our view, we really need sort of community-owned, community-governed infrastructure. So by that I mean, sort of resources that are sort of housed within the academy, that aren't commercial, but instead really prioritize the interests of researchers, of medical practitioners in a way that the commercial tools just simply haven't. And we've seen libraries start to change to adapt to this. And there are a number of libraries, including MIT in the United States, that have actually put all of their collections budget, all the millions of dollars that they spend on, sort of on journals, on books, sort of bringing content in, and actually putting that collection budget under what's called their scholarly communications office, or sort of the part of the institution that is tasked with, sort of supporting the institution as sort of in this push towards open. And again, as part of that, many more libraries now are starting to walk away from these what are called big deal contracts with large commercial publishers, where they pay large amounts of money for a single journal, or for sort of a bundle package of all of the journals that a publisher sells. And earlier this summer, MIT walked away from all of their Elsevier-owned journals when they couldn't come to an agreement. And MIT is hardly the only example. Spark actually tracks all of these cancellations of big deals on our big deal cancellation tracker. And that can both put financial pressure on these commercial publishers to better align with university values, but also walking away from these big deals can unlock the resources necessary to fund research infrastructure that's open by default and aligned with the community's interests. Increasingly, researchers are sort of taking the power that they have into their own hands. And there are now, tons of examples of the entire editorial board of specific journals resigning in protest and starting a new open access journal when they can't either flip what was once a subscription-based journal to open, or can't agree on the terms of that flip. So this is one example of a journal called Lingua, where that editorial board resigned and started a new journal called Glossa that really sort of took over that journal's place in the community. But again, just shows sort of one example of how researchers, authors have a lot of power in sort of this push for open if they choose to exercise it. There are entire new platforms that are being built out, like the Open Library of the Humanities, that don't charge anything to authors or to readers, and have other types of models, like membership models for libraries, that cover those necessary costs. So there aren't charges for again, either authors or readers. And some of the established players that have charged those article processing charges, like PLOS, are starting to explore these different models that don't require those. So many of you might be familiar with with PLOS titles, given their medical focus in many places, and those are some of the journals that are experimenting with this new model to get away from those fees. So just to close, I just want to close by sort of highlighting how in this push towards open, it's important to keep in mind that this access to knowledge is a fundamental human right. And the Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden, actually spoke to this point in an event that we co-hosted with the UN in 2018, talking about how equity of access is a human right in the digital age. And I actually think it goes further than that. I think there's also sort of the right to participation in these systems, not just to read research that's produced elsewhere, but actually to participate in that scholarly conversation in research directly. And in a follow-up event last year, again at the United Nations headquarters, we co-hosted a roundtable that sort of spoke to this. And also sort of flagged open research as a necessary accelerator to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And that in order to get there, it wasn't enough just to be able to read the research literature, but there also needed to be equity of participation as well. And I think given IFMSA's global nature is one of the most, if not the most globally inclusive student organization on the planet. that IFMSA is particularly well placed, as an international organization, as well as individually through its NMOs, to have a strong impact, to call out, the inequity of both the current system as well as the inequities that are starting to be codified in the open system in some places. And sort of really push the community to be intentional about how we build open systems to make sure that they serve the entire world. Not just commercial players that have been dominant in the space, or a small part of the world that's better represented currently on editorial boards, but that needs to be diversified if we're going to have a fundamentally equitable system. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Abdullah, but happy to answer any questions either now or at the end.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nick, for those amazing insights you have presented to us. Very interesting stats and numbers from the status quo of open access from all over the world. You have talked about the status quo of equity and the gaps and biases that actually are present in our open access reality, and our roles as students and student organizations, student bodies, as advocates for open access. I know that you have a very busy schedule, and you will be having to leave in very shortly. So I think we can open the floor now for questions. So if you are guys watching us on YouTube, you can feel free to drop your questions on the live chat and we'll be reading them. If you are joining us here through Zoom, you can also send your questions on the chat box. And we have a first question. So from Ahmed Sharif, he says, thank you so much for the enlightening speech, Nick. I'd like to ask, how can we be more productive and have a positive effect on the open access movement as medical students? Can we do something else other than online campaigns and what we are currently doing? Nick, over to you.
Sure. Well, there's so many different opportunities. There are, so let me sort of break it out into a few different things, sort of at the highest level, because of the sort of how big IFMSA is and how globally representative it is in a way that virtually no other organizations really are. I think IFMSA is particularly well placed to speak to the need for a system of research that is globally representative and inclusive for the first time, right? We don't have and have never had a system of research that's globally inclusive. It's always sort of privileged, the research questions and sort of research from from North America and Europe. And I think IFMSA is particularly well placed to call that out, to sort of articulate what that would look like, and hold the people that currently have power, their feet to the fire, and being uncomfortable with the current system and calling that out and talking to the impact that has, because I think you all see it every day, in your work as medical professionals, again, in a way that most others don't. So I think at the highest level, IFMSA can really be helpful in shaping that global conversation, because of how you're structured. Sort of one layer down, there are a lot of policy discussions that are happening right now, that again, I think IFMSA can be directly involved in. There's UNESCO is developing its open science policy with call for input that IFMSA could contribute to. For example, this is an active area of policy making, and I would guess a pretty large proportion of different NMOs countries, from Latin America, where there's been really strong open access infrastructure that's been in place for decades, in Cielo and Redaleak, but that are struggling to sort of fend off sort of the pushes by the large commercial publishers to buy up some of the journals in Latin America, in a way that can undermine what has been an incredibly successful open system. There are countries in Africa that are deciding sort of what path they're going to pursue towards open research, and whether that is one that focuses on sort of a more European model of funding open access journals, and paying for article processing charges, or going sort of a different direction, and instead focusing on repositories and making the manuscripts of articles publicly or openly accessible, even if they're published in subscription journals. Sort of we think is that second path is probably a better one to get to a more equitable system in the end. And I'm happy to speak in detail about that, but that's not sort of what was asked. So I'll just put a pin in that particular point. But finally, sort of through all of your individual NMOs, I think just sort of doing the educational work on the ground about what open research is, and making sure that the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of students that are involved with IFMSA NMOs, sort of have a grounding in open research, so that when they go to publish, they make their work accessible as well. Since if you think about all of the publications by IFMSA alums, it's sort of a mind-boggling number, you would imagine. So there really is a range of activities from sort of the broadest global policy agenda setting level to policy advocacy, to more sort of education and awareness raising, given that IFMSAs, the students in your network are also the target audience, right? And making their work openly accessible.
Thank you so much for your answer. We have another question from Lucas. He says, Nick, incredible presentation. I wanted to know first, what's your idea of how can student and youth lead organizations help in develop open access and open science, mainly in COVID-19 situation of disinfodemics? Best regards.
Yeah, so I think sort of Ahmed's question sort of started to get at part of this, and I think it's also important to recognize it's not just that students and sort of the emerging leaders are really starting to lead the conversation here, and really is an opportunity to lead to the point of sort of disinformation epidemics. I think that sort of the openness is an important answer to sort of to combating those, right? There's this this sort of challenge that we have at the moment, where sort of that sort of vetted high quality information is often very expensive, right? Like thinking about paywalls for newspapers, for example, or paywalls for academic journals. That stuff's not free. In many cases, you have to have access to it. But conspiracy theories, or disinformation, that's free, right? It's easy. You can't go on Facebook, without sort of hitting those things. It comes at you, it seeks you out. It doesn't cost anything. And so, I think making high quality information, particularly research, openly accessible, is an important answer to, sort of combating disinformation. Of course, it's only part of the answer, right? Like, just making scholarly articles accessible doesn't necessarily reach, sort of like individual members of the public that might not be as well equipped. But it does make it more accessible to the people that can translate that information to a wider audience, or to build credibility, because if people want to see, sort of what information's based on, like why, like how somebody's justifying a point, they can actually click through and actually see that information for themselves, rather than having to take someone's word for it.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Jack, who is wondering, how can we promote or support open access journals over subscriptions journals, considering that most students prefer those, especially through tools like Sci-Hub? Greetings from Panama.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, there's a lot of work that students can also do at the institutional level. So there are, an increasing number of what are called institutional open access policies, where an individual university puts in place a policy that requires that any manuscripts from from faculty authors need to be made publicly accessible through their institutional repository. That don't require that authors have to publish in open access journals, though they would immediately sort of fulfill the requirements of those policies if they did. But even most subscription-based journals actually have more than, I think, 80% now of subscription-based journals allow authors to make some form of their article publicly accessible in a repository. So even if it's published in a subscription journal, somebody can, through a repository, get access to that free version. And so Jack mentioned Sci-Hub, which I imagine many folks on the call are familiar with, which is a resource that was created. It's a sort of huge repository, I think more than 40 or 50 million journal articles that many folks rely on for access. That is sort of constantly being taken down because of publisher lawsuits, because most of those PDFs are sort of illegal, copyright infringing versions of articles. And I think Sci-Hub really does show sort of the magnitude of the problem. I think Sci-Hub also shows just how big the gap has gotten between sort of what's possible and how sort of poorly equipped our current infrastructure is, right? There's, a graduate student from Kazakhstan was able to build a system that was arguably more effective at distributing access to journal articles than our billion-dollar infrastructure. And I think it's, I don't think Sci-Hub is the long-term, solution. I think it's more an example of, sort of the problem that we're facing rather than a sustainable solution. And there are legal tools like Unpaywall or like the open access button that do a similar function, but sort of automatically point users towards publicly accessible versions of legally available articles and repositories. So if you haven't started using Unpaywall or the open access button, would definitely encourage you to check those out, and use those. And to Jack's question, look at things like an institutional open access policy as well to complement national policies.
Okay, here's a very relevant question that could follow this one, and it's very relevant to the answer from Juliana that says, do you believe that in the near future, subscription journals will no longer exist or significantly lose the position or impact they currently have?
Yeah, I guess my answer depends on how near the near future is. I do think that that they will continue to decline, but I don't know, how quickly they will go away completely, even in a system that's becoming more open by default. So, a large part of journals now are what are called hybrid journals, that are essentially they're subscription-based journals where an author can pay a fee to make an individual article within that journal openly accessible. And so, if you look at, Elsevier will talk about how they're the world's largest open access publisher. And that's largely driven by the fact that they've made, virtually all of their journals these hybrid journals where you can pay to make an individual article open, but if you haven't paid, then the rest are subscription only. And we just think that's a fundamentally terrible model, to be frank. And the reason why is that it creates a really strong perverse incentive for the commercial players to never fully flip these journals to open, right? Because they can continue collecting subscription revenue and get another revenue stream of these article processing charges on top. And so they're getting even more, resources out of the current system. Why would they fully flip to an open model and forego all the subscription revenue? And so I think that's a main concern and one of the things that I think would slow the transition. But sort of on the other end, there are, as I mentioned, an increasing number of libraries that are starting to walk away from their big subscription packages. that I think can help create more pressure to flip to a fully open system. So, it's it's hard to, to sort of say how quickly it will happen, but I do think it is currently happening, and it, sort of, I think will, so reach, a pretty high degree of completion. I think there may still ultimately be, some journals that, are subscription based, especially the sort of prestige glamour journals like a Science, like a Nature, that you make so much money through subscriptions that it's hard to make anywhere close to that through an open means. But I think it's more a question of what the system looks like and sort of whose interests are prioritized, rather than sort of whether or not we'll get to open. I think we will, and I think in sort of a reasonable amount of time, it'll just be a big question of whether that's an open system that sort of prioritizes how much money commercial entities can make, or whether it prioritizes things like equity and inclusion.
Thank you very much. We all definitely wish that this will become the reality very soon. Another question from Sophia. She says, thank you very much for your time and efforts, Nick. You mentioned language barriers in research. Do you have ideas how researchers that do not speak English can be supported in the publication process?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're just making more space for non-English publications, promoting more resources for translations. So it's not just sort of this default that we take for granted that if you want to participate in the global research conversation, you have to do it in English. These are challenges that we can overcome, but you have to actually be intentional about it and resource them, right, to support folks, to translate these resources into other languages. And translate research that's published in languages other than English to English, so it can reach a broader global audience. But we have to be intentional about that. We have to provide resources for that to happen. And I think until we prioritize it in that way and provide the kinds of funding that you need, it will be difficult. But I think again, these are areas where IFMSA can sort of call out how this is harmful, and marginalizes communities that don't speak English natively, and hold the global research community accountable for sort of committing to being better on that question. And ultimately, I think it's really up to sort of folks that are facing those language barriers to tell sort of us and to tell the global research community what's most helpful and what they would like to see, sort of rather than me saying that. But I think as sort of a global policy organization, sort of our focus is on sort of raising up those voices. They're sort of asking those questions and proposing solutions, and trying to create that accountability, for this challenge.
Thank you very much. I understand that you have to leave very soon, but we have still 2 more questions. Is that fine? Can we go for them?
Oh yeah. No, I can stay for at least 4 or 5 more minutes.
Okay, perfect. So another question from Han Sol from Korea, and she's asking, thank you for your amazing presentation. The current status quo regarding open access is depressing, but the efforts of institutions and researchers to promote open access are inspiring. What do you think is the biggest obstacle in promoting open access? And also I want to ask about stakeholders that organizations like IFMSA and Spark should contact, communicate, and work with to promote open access.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a way, it certainly is depressing, right? Like we're on the cusp of squandering this incredible opportunity to rebuild the foundations of research, right? You don't get the chance to sort of fundamentally change how research is communicated, very often, right? This really is a unique opportunity, and it is, it is depressing to think that we might squander that and just replicate, sort of the inequitable systems that we have had. But at the same time, sort of I've been working on these issues since I was a student, how many years ago? 12 or so years ago. And just the way these conversations are happening now is just totally different, right? Like I remember when I first started working on these issues in 2007, 2008, like seeing an article in like the New York Times that like mentioned something about open was just like, oh wow, this is incredible. Like it's actually being talked about in like a national media outlet. And like last weekend, the vice president of the United States, who's running to be president, talked about open research in an interview that had nothing to do with sort of open or research, in campaign mode. Right, this has gone from an idea to the default in Europe, right? China is moving not just from opening up research, but actually questioning journal-based metrics that have been a big hang up. So the amount of movement that's happened in the last 10 years really is incredible. So I think there's a lot of reason for optimism. It's just that now we need to have that kind of movement, not around whether sort of open's good or not, but sort of whether equity is centered, or not, and having that kind of a breakthrough within the open research movement. And I think again, IFMSA is just so well placed to raise these questions and create that accountability. And so in answering Hansel's question about stakeholders, I think it's everybody from UNESCO to sort of the large sort of IGO type organizations that intersect with open policy, to all of the national governments and bodies like the European Union that are making policy or issuing recommendations around this, to raising it to nationally, that you expect to see a research that's not just open, but actually fundamentally prioritizes equity. And that if you see, say, your national funder signing on to policies that don't reflect those values, calling that out. And we're happy to be sort of a full partner in working on that, and have worked side by side with IFMSA and many NMOs for close to a decade now, and it's been one of the best parts about my job, frankly. I just encourage you to reach out to to me directly. I'll put my information here in the chat. But it's been incredible to work with so many folks from IFMSA, and that you really have had an incredible impact. I wish I could mention like just even half the folks that I've worked with. And regret that we don't have the opportunity for some of the in-person conversations that have been so helpful. But I hope that we can again. And one other idea, I guess perhaps I'll come close to closing with, is just that we had some conversations a year or two ago about potentially theming some of the IFMSA, like an August meeting or a March meeting around sort of open research and equity in research. But I think sort of things like that could also be another way of sort of really sort of raising the profile of these discussions with IFMSA and sort of signaling it as a priority, to help make sure sort of every NMO has exposure to this issue and some understanding of sort of what's happening, what IFMSA is doing, and how they might translate that locally.
Perfect, thank you. One last question, or should we conclude? Up to you.
You can do one more.
Okay, perfect. Another question from Lucas.
No pressure on Lucas.
So based on the pipeline effects and that still today, gender equity in research is far from ideal. How can open access help in developing this equity and inclusion of all science making and leaderships?
Yeah, I think to answer that, I think this shift to an open system really allows us to more sort of deeply interrogate, sort of the foundations of research. That as we're rebuilding it, we get to question, sort of these broader structures. And I think, the answer to that question of, sort of how to address these really deep-seated issues, like the gender equity one that Lucas mentions, is to use this opportunity to rebuild the sort of system for communicating research, to get people in the habit of sort of looking at the gender or the geographic representation of who a journal is publishing, or who's on an editorial board, or who's speaking at a conference, or who's on the board of an organization, and really sort of understanding and internalizing that you have to pay attention to these things, and that if you don't, others are paying attention to it, and will call attention to the fact that you're not taking these things seriously, or not making, you're not, sort of the impact of, your actions aren't sort of consistent with, say, the values that you're espousing. And so I think, that's sort of the opportunity, for, in my mind, is not just building a system that's open, but in the same breath talking about, sort of gender representation, geographic representation, language representation, as we're rebuilding these foundations, and make the expectation that research is equitable, sort of a fundamental one, rather than something that's currently at the margins.
Okay, we have one last interesting part of our webinar, but before we move to that, I would like to give a huge thank you to Nick for joining us today in this webinar. Thank you, Nick, for being a very good friend of IFMSA throughout the years. I'm very sure that when I say this, I speak on behalf of all IFMSA members, that we truly appreciate and value our collaboration with you and with Spark, and we hope and aspire to continue advocating for open science hand in hand with you. And I personally look forward to catch up with you and talk about future plans. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. Always appreciate the invitations, and it's so great to work with IFMSA, and look forward to collaborating in the future. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Okay. Now I will be moving on to the next part of our webinar, which is showcasing IFMSA's work as a global youth advocate of the open access movement. And as you know, we all in IFMSA work on open access, but it is usually led by SCORI, the Standing Committee on Research Exchange. We have been working on more than 1,500 research projects during our exchange programs in different countries around the world, and the number is increasing every single year. A very interesting and amazing project that SCORI has developed is the IFMSA Research Camp. So far, we had conducted 2 editions, one in Hungary in 2018, another one in Georgia in 2019. This year, it was supposed to happen in Romania, but due to COVID-19, it didn't happen. But with COVID, I think we have more opportunities to include more IFMSA members, to diversify the audience, the targets, and who knows, maybe soon enough, we will have an online research camp. The research camp is, of course, one of IFMSA events that builds capacities of IFMSA members in terms of research and research methodologies. Open access has been always a core topic in the IFMSA sessions, especially in SCORI sessions and different IFMSA events, general assemblies, regional meetings, and sub-regional trainings. And here are some lovely pictures from our March meeting 2020 in Rwanda. Also, educational activities have been developed in areas including open science, which is the main theme that includes open access, as well as other topics like critical appraisal and basics of medical research, in which open access is also focused on and elaborated on to our members. The annual Exchanges Week campaign that is conducted with Scopy and SCORI, we increase awareness about the exchanges of IFMSA. We build capacities and prepare exchange students from all IFMSA NMOs on exchange experiences, intercultural competencies, and we definitely mention and build capacities on open access through that. One of the recent awareness campaigns that SCORI has conducted is the Research Awareness Campaign. It has reached a lot of IFMSA members worldwide. A lot of people participated, and it helped to build more awareness about research, the process of working on research and publishing researches in different journals and academic in different academia platforms. Abstract submissions to international conferences, and of course, that's one of the things that IFMSA does in promoting its work externally. And here's a picture as an example of what we do is the AMI conference that IFMSA takes place in through the Student Task Force every single year since almost 10 years now. And during those meetings, we showcase our work on research education, open science, and including open access. So in terms of the policy work and policy making, you all have probably heard about the previous IFMSA policy on open access, open education, and open data, because it has a catchy name, 3 open words in one phrase, and that policy document has recently expired and was replaced by a new policy document that is called Open Science. And if you wonder why is that, the reason is that we wanted to be more inclusive. We wanted to expand our scope of work to include not only just open access, open data, open education, but also to expand our work on reproducible research as well as open review. Those are areas that have not been fully discovered yet by IFMSA, and navigating those opportunities could open a lot of doors to our IFMSA NMOs for collaborations with externals, for campaigns, for national efforts, etc., etc. In addition to that, we have the IFMSA policy document on access to research and research education that is also very popular in IFMSA. And this year we have adopted a global priority on open science. So now we have a policy document on open science as well as a global priority on open science. And both are there for the same specific reason. So this year we have, I would personally believe, the most or the richest open access week in terms of content and materials. We had a small working group of dedicated people who have worked on developing those materials and promoting a lot of content about a lot of facts and knowledge and statistics and insights about open access through the different IFMSA communication platforms. And here I would like to applaud their efforts. Namely, those people are the Open Access Week Small Working Group, and they are Armand Salah from Burkina Faso, Rena from Ifmsa Philippines, Ahmed Hassan Sharif from IFMSA Egypt, Lucas Ponte, IFMSA Brazil, Neil Salian from MSI India, Kartikia Ojha from MSI India, Mohammed Amash Sohail from IFMSA Pakistan, Andrea Trejo from IFMSA Honduras, and Jack Quintero from IFMSA Panama. Apologies if I have butchered anyone's name. And I would also like to give a huge thank you to, of course, the SCORI director, Veronica Moreno, for all her continuous support, as well as for the SCORI international team who have been there and supported the smoking group with a lot of efforts. And thank you and appreciation is also extended to all IFMSA members that have been engaged through our platforms in terms of the Open Access Week, and to everyone who has helped us, who have sent us comments, questions, who have attended our webinar, who have attended our open space discussion, who have sent us videos. You all were part of this, I believe, successful Open Access Week. And I hope that this webinar was the cherry on top of the cake. We are now ready to wrap up our campaign, and that should happen in the upcoming 24 hours. Thank you once more, everyone. And the webinar of Open Access Week 2020 is now concluded.